The polished mahogany tables of the Skylux Airlines boardroom had never witnessed such panic. Executives frantically refreshed their screens as company stock plummeted 12% and counting. The viral video playing on the wall screen told the story: a black first-class passenger being forcibly removed from his rightful seat to accommodate a white woman who had slipped cash to the flight attendant. "Who exactly did we kick off that plane?" whispered the CEO, his face ashen. The answer came like a thunderbolt. "Marcus Richardson, sir. The tech billionaire who owns 25% of our company's shares and was considering a $50 million partnership. Sometimes karma doesn't just arrive, it flies first class." Today's story explores what happens when discrimination meets accountability in the most unexpected way. Imagine boarding a flight you've paid thousands for, settling into your assigned first-class seat, only to be told you don't look like you belong there. This scenario plays out more often than the airline industry would like to admit, and it reveals uncomfortable truths about how we perceive others based solely on appearance. On a sunny Tuesday morning at O'Hare International Airport, Marcus Richardson boarded Skylux Airlines Flight 2317 to San Francisco. At 42, Marcus had built RightTech Solutions from a startup coding in his apartment to a $2.8 billion AI company specializing in eliminating bias from customer service interactions. The irony of what was about to happen wouldn't be lost on anyone. Unlike many wealthy executives, Marcus carried himself with humility. Earlier that day, security cameras had captured him helping an elderly woman with her luggage, holding doors for strangers, and thanking every service worker by name. Not because he was being watched, but because that's who he was. As Marcus settled into seat 2A, specifically chosen for its legroom so he could work during the flight, flight attendant Jessica Miller approached with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her tone polite but with an undercurrent of condescension. "We need you to move to accommodate our VIP passenger." Behind her stood Karen Wickfield, an elegantly dressed woman tapping her designer watch impatiently. "I always sit there," she muttered, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "It's practically my seat." What followed was a textbook case of discrimination masked as customer service. Despite Marcus calmly showing his platinum member card and boarding pass, Jessica insisted that this particular seat was typically reserved for a better customer. As a researcher who has studied discriminatory incidents in service industries for over a decade, I've identified 3 common patterns that were all present in this interaction. First, the assumption that a person of color doesn't belong in a premium space, regardless of their actual status or credentials. Second, the use of coded language. Note how Jessica referred to Karen as a better customer, rather than directly mentioning race. Third, the escalation to authority figures when the target doesn't immediately comply. When Marcus politely but firmly refused to move, Supervisor Trevor arrived, followed eventually by Captain Reynolds. The situation escalated from a request to a demand to an outright threat. "Sir, if you continue to be uncooperative," Trevor stated, "we'll have no choice but to remove you from the flight." The most damning moment, captured on video by multiple passengers, came when Karen discreetly slipped folded bills into Trevor's pocket, whispering, "Thanks for handling that situation. First class should have standards." What makes this case particularly significant is how it exemplifies what sociologists call elite-sanctioned discrimination, when authority figures validate and enforce biased treatment, giving it an appearance of legitimacy. Captain Reynolds, representing the highest authority on the aircraft, had the power to de-escalate the situation. Instead, he chose to support his crew's discriminatory actions. "This is your final warning," the captain stated. "Move to another seat or we'll call security." With quiet dignity, Marcus began recording the interaction on his phone. "I want to be clear about what's happening here," he said calmly. "I'm being threatened with removal from this flight because I won't give up my assigned seat to another passenger who wants it." Minutes later, security officers escorted Marcus off the plane. He walked with his head held high, maintaining his composure even as he experienced a humiliation that countless others have faced without the resources or platform to fight back. What the Skylux crew didn't realize was that the man they had just removed was not only a billionaire tech CEO but also the airline's largest individual shareholder and the potential savior they had been courting for a crucial technology partnership. This part of the story reveals something fascinating about power dynamics and accountability in the digital age. Before smartphones and social media, incidents like this often remained isolated experiences, with corporations holding all the cards in controlling the narrative. Today, power can shift dramatically in the time it takes to upload a video. As Marcus left the terminal, he made two crucial calls. First to his legal team, and second to his chief operating officer, Elise Thompson. "I was removed from the plane, but they picked the wrong person to humiliate." Meanwhile, the video was already spreading across social media platforms. A passenger who had followed Marcus off the plane approached him in the terminal. "I recorded everything," she said, showing him clear footage that captured not only his removal, but also the damning moment when Karen slipped money to Trevor. This was clearly discrimination. "You should have this." What happened next demonstrates how quickly corporate priorities can shift when reputation and stock prices are at stake. In Skylux's headquarters, CEO Richard Williams was reviewing quarterly projections when his PR director called with news of the viral video. "A video is going viral showing one of our passengers being removed from a flight this morning," she explained urgently. Williams initially dismissed the concern. Passengers get removed for disruptive behavior every day. But as he watched the footage, his expression shifted from annoyance to horror. "Who is he?" Williams demanded. "Have we identified the passenger?" The answer changed everything. "Yes, sir. According to the manifest, his name is Marcus Richardson." The silence that followed speaks volumes about how differently situations are handled depending on who is involved. Had Marcus been an ordinary passenger without wealth or influence, this incident likely would have been addressed with a form letter apology at best. Instead, an emergency board meeting was convened with unprecedented urgency. When Marcus entered the boardroom, the effect was immediate. Every conversation ceased mid-sentence. "Mr. Richardson," Williams began, his voice strained with forced cordiality, "we want to express our deepest apologies for the inexcusable treatment you experienced today." Marcus's response cut through the corporate damage control. "I'm not interested in apologies. As your largest individual shareholder, I have one demand and one decision. First, every staff member involved is terminated immediately. Second, I am canceling the proposed contract between my tech company and this airline." The implications hung heavy in the air. A 25% stock dump would be catastrophic. The loss of the $50 million modernization contract would leave them years behind their competitors. As if on cue, a financial analyst burst into the room. "Sir, news of the incident is already affecting our stock price. We're down 12% and falling. Analysts are predicting a possible 30% drop by closing if we don't take decisive action." This moment illustrates a concept I call leveraged accountability, when someone has the power to force consequences that might otherwise be avoided. While we might wish that moral considerations alone would drive companies to address discrimination, the reality is that financial pressure often proves more effective. Studies have shown that corporations respond more quickly and comprehensively to diversity issues when there are clear financial incentives. A 2022 analysis of corporate responses to discrimination incidents found that companies lost an average of 4.1% market value when incidents went viral, with losses extending to 22% in cases with video evidence and high-profile victims. The man they removed from the plane now held the fate of the airline in his hands. Not because discrimination against him was worse than discrimination against anyone else, but because he had the leverage to demand accountability in ways most victims never could. 3 floors below the boardroom, in a sterile conference room, Trevor, Jessica, and Captain Reynolds sat in uncomfortable silence. They had been summoned without explanation, though the growing whispers throughout the company had given them reason for concern. The HR director entered promptly, accompanied by legal counsel and 2 security officers who positioned themselves by the door. "I'll be direct," she began, placing 3 identical folders on the table. "Your employment with Skylux Airlines is terminated effective immediately." The statement landed like a physical blow. Jessica's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. Trevor's face contorted with indignation. Captain Reynolds simply closed his eyes, his weathered face suddenly looking decades older. "We are sorry." Trevor was the first to recover, his voice rising with each word. "We were just following procedure. That passenger was being difficult and disrupting the boarding process." In response, the HR director turned her laptop toward them. The viral video began to play, Trevor's condescension perfectly captured, Jessica's discomfort evident, the captain's abdication of responsibility clear for all to see. Was accepting money from a passenger to discriminate against another passenger procedure? The HR director asked, her tone making it clear there was no acceptable answer. This scene illustrates an important point about accountability. It often feels unfair to those being held accountable. Research in organizational psychology shows that people who engage in discriminatory behavior typically don't view their actions as discriminatory. Instead, they justify their behavior through various cognitive mechanisms. 1. Minimization. It wasn't that bad. 2. Procedural justification. I was just following policy. 3. Denial of intent. I didn't mean it that way. 4. Displacement of responsibility. I was just doing what I was told. We see all of these mechanisms at play in the responses of the terminated employees. Jessica broke down, tears streaming down her face. "We made a terrible mistake. I knew it was wrong even as it was happening, but I didn't stop it." Captain Reynolds, a man who had navigated through literal storms during his career, seemed unable to weather this one. "I was just trusting my crew's assessment. I didn't personally witness the initial confrontation." The HR director delivered the final blow. "The passenger you removed was Marcus Richardson, CEO of Right Tech Solutions and our largest individual shareholder." As they were led from the room, the 3 former employees experienced what Marcus had felt earlier that day: the humiliation of being escorted out while others watched. The symmetry was both perfect and devastating. Meanwhile, in the main auditorium of Skylux headquarters, hundreds of employees had gathered for an unprecedented announcement. The CEO stood on stage, flanked by Marcus Richardson and his team. "Today, Skylux Airlines failed one of our passengers in the most fundamental way," Williams began. "This failure wasn't just an isolated incident. It was symptomatic of systemic issues that we must address immediately and comprehensively." What followed was a commitment that went far beyond the typical corporate response to discrimination incidents. Skylux announced a company-wide grounding for mandatory training, every flight, every route, every service suspended for 48 hours while all 11,000 plus employees participated in the first phase of a comprehensive bias training program developed by Right Tech Solutions. In an industry where minutes of delay cost thousands, a 48-hour complete shutdown was unprecedented. It would cost the airline millions, but the message it sent about their commitment to change was priceless. This response stands in stark contrast to how discrimination incidents are typically handled. According to a 2021 study of corporate responses to racial discrimination claims, 78% of companies opt for what researchers call symbolic management, public statements, donations to relevant causes, or superficial policy changes that don't address underlying cultural issues. Only 14% implement substantive structural changes like Skylux did here. The difference? Usually it's leverage. Without Marcus's shareholding position and the viral pressure, Skylux likely would have followed the more common path of minimal response. The consequences for Trevor, Jessica, and Captain Reynolds extended beyond job loss. In the digital age, accountability follows you everywhere. Their names and faces had become synonymous with discrimination in an industry where reputation is currency. Trevor sat in his apartment surrounded by rejection emails from other airlines. Previous experience noted, but we've decided to pursue other candidates at this time. The polite corporate language couldn't mask the reality. No one wanted to hire the man from that viral video. Karen Wickfield wasn't spared either. Skylux implemented a lifetime ban, but the consequences extended far beyond her preferred airline. Her company placed her on administrative leave pending an investigation into her conduct. Friends distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with the woman now branded as Airline Karen, across social media platforms. For perhaps the first time, she was forced to confront the real impact of her entitlement. not just on Marcus but on her own life and reputation. In the weeks that followed, Skylux Airlines underwent the most comprehensive transformation in its 30-year history. Conference rooms across the country were converted into training centers. Flight schedules were modified to ensure every employee participated in the mandatory program. The training wasn't the standard corporate checkbox exercise that employees had grown accustomed to ignoring. It was immersive, challenging, and at times uncomfortable. Employees were confronted with their own biases through sophisticated simulation exercises developed by RightTech's team of behavioral psychologists and AI specialists. Marcus made a point of personally addressing many of these sessions, standing before rooms filled with skeptical, sometimes defensive employees. "This is your opportunity to be part of the solution," he told them, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience. "What happened to me happens to people without my resources or platform every day. Today, we begin changing that." For some, his presence was transformative, putting a human face to what management might otherwise have dismissed as a PR crisis. For others, his willingness to engage despite his treatment demonstrated a commitment to genuine change rather than retribution. Skylux implemented sweeping policy changes. New guidelines establishing zero tolerance for discrimination, enhanced protocols for handling seating disputes, and protection for employees who reported misconduct. The employee handbook was rewritten to explicitly state that accepting gifts or payments from passengers in exchange for preferential treatment was grounds for immediate termination. Passengers began noticing differences almost immediately. Brief interviews captured at gates and baggage claims revealed a shifting perception. "The flight attendants seem more attentive to everyone now," noted one frequent flyer. "Before, it always felt like there was an invisible hierarchy based on how you looked or what you were wearing. I actually had a problem with my seat assignment," shared another passenger. "But the way they handled it was completely professional. They found a solution that worked for everyone without making anyone feel less valued." As promised, Marcus gradually reinstated his investment as measurable changes were implemented and verified by independent auditors. Skylux's stock began to recover, though the road back would be long. The most surprising development came 6 months after the incident when Marcus Richardson announced a new initiative through his foundation, the Second Chance program, designed specifically for individuals who had lost their jobs due to bias incidents. "Accountability doesn't mean permanent punishment," Marcus explained at the press conference launching the program. "It means earning your way back. We cannot build a more just society if we don't create pathways for those who have acknowledged their mistakes and done the work to change." Among the first participants in the program were Trevor, Jessica, and Captain Reynolds. The journey wasn't easy for any of them. The program required them to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves, to understand the impact of their actions not just on Marcus but on countless others who experienced similar treatment without the power to fight back. Trevor, who had initially been the most resistant, underwent the most profound transformation. In group sessions, he spoke about growing up in a household where casual racism was the norm, about never questioning the biases he had inherited until they cost him everything. "I never saw myself as prejudiced," he admitted during one particularly powerful session. "I thought that because I didn't use slurs or explicitly hate anyone, I was one of the good ones. This experience has shown me how bias operates even when we don't recognize it in ourselves." Jessica's journey focused on moral courage, the willingness to speak up even when it might cost you. "I knew what was happening was wrong," she shared, "but I was afraid of losing my job if I challenged Trevor or the captain. Now I understand that my silence made me complicit." Captain Reynolds, the oldest of the three, perhaps had the hardest road. Decades of believing he had treated everyone fairly were called into question by his actions that day. "I trusted the wrong things," he reflected. "I trusted hierarchy over humanity. I'll spend the rest of my career making that right." With certificates from the program in hand, Trevor and Jessica began applying for entry-level positions at different airlines. Their applications now included their story, not as an excuse but as context for the growth they had undergone. Jessica was the first to secure a position, not as a flight attendant but as a ground crew member at a regional carrier. The pay was less than half of what she had earned at Skylux. The hours were longer, and the work was physically demanding, but it was a second chance she had once thought impossible. Trevor followed a month later, starting in baggage handling at another airline. Captain Reynolds, given his age and experience, faced a different path. He wouldn't fly commercially again but found purpose teaching in the Second Chance program, helping others understand the consequences of the kinds of decisions he had made. The Skylux incident raises important questions about accountability, redemption, and systemic change. While this particular story had a relatively positive resolution, it's worth examining why it took a billionaire shareholder to create meaningful change. For every Marcus Richardson with the power to demand accountability, there are thousands of passengers who experience discrimination without recourse. Their stories don't go viral. They don't have leverage. They simply absorb the humiliation and carry on. A 2023 study by the National Consumer Rights Association found that passengers of color were approximately 4.3 times more likely to be removed from flights for subjective reasons like creating discomfort or being disruptive compared to white passengers. When these incidents occur, 91% result in no meaningful accountability for the airline or staff involved. What makes the Skylux case unique isn't the discrimination itself, that happens daily across the service industry, but the consequences that followed. This raises uncomfortable questions about how justice operates in our society. Should accountability depend on the status of the victim? Should meaningful change require viral exposure? The redemption arc of Trevor, Jessica, and Captain Reynolds also merits consideration. Their journey illustrates both the possibility of growth and the reality that actions have consequences that can't simply be undone with an apology. The Second Chance program represents an important middle ground between two extremes we often see in our discourse around accountability: permanent cancellation with no path to redemption on one hand, and quick forgiveness without meaningful change on the other. True accountability requires both consequences and opportunity. Consequences serious enough to motivate change, and opportunity structured to facilitate growth. Without consequences, there's little incentive to examine harmful behaviors. Without opportunity for redemption, there's little reason to do the difficult work of changing. Skylux itself was transformed. Independent auditors confirmed what passengers had already noticed. The airline now led the industry in customer satisfaction across all demographics. For the first time, Black, Hispanic, and Middle Eastern passengers reported service experiences equal to or better than those of white passengers, a metric that should have been standard but had never been achieved in the industry. In a private meeting at Skylux headquarters, Marcus sat across from CEO Richard Williams, reviewing the 6-month progress report. "You've shown real change," Marcus acknowledged, closing the folder containing the latest metrics. "That deserves recognition." Williams nodded, the weight of the previous months evident in the new lines on his face. "This hasn't been easy," he admitted, "but it's been necessary. What happened to you that day forced us to confront issues we'd been ignoring for years." "That's often how change happens," Marcus replied. "Not through comfort, but through confrontation." The two men stood and shook hands. No longer adversaries, not quite friends, but partners in a transformation that was changing not just one airline but setting a new standard for an entire industry. The story of Marcus Richardson and Skylux Airlines offers several profound lessons about dignity, accountability, and change. First, it reminds us that dignity is not something that should be earned through status, wealth, or appearance. It's an inherent right that belongs to every person regardless of who they are or how they look. When we treat dignity as conditional, we participate in systems of discrimination that harm not just individuals but our collective humanity. Second, this story illustrates that meaningful accountability requires both consequences and opportunity. The termination of the employees involved wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a process that included both justice and redemption. True accountability isn't about punishment for punishment's sake. It's about creating the conditions for genuine change. Third, we see that systemic problems require systemic solutions. Skylux's transformation wasn't achieved through firing a few employees or issuing a public apology. It required a comprehensive examination of policies, practices, and culture, followed by concrete changes at every level of the organization. Perhaps most importantly, this story challenges us to consider what justice looks like in a world where power and influence are unequally distributed. While we can celebrate the positive outcome in this particular case, we must also acknowledge the uncomfortable reality that such outcomes remain the exception rather than the rule. The question for all of us becomes, how do we create systems where accountability doesn't depend on viral videos or the status of those harmed? How do we build a world where dignity is truly universal, where justice is accessible to everyone, and where redemption is possible for those willing to do the work of changing? Sometimes justice isn't about punishment. Sometimes it's about progress that transforms not just policies and procedures but hearts and minds. That's the kind of justice that doesn't just correct a wrong. It creates a better future for everyone involved. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever witnessed or experienced discrimination in a service setting? How was it handled? What do you think about the balance between accountability and redemption that we saw in this story? Your experiences and perspectives add valuable dimensions to these complex conversations, and sharing them helps others understand the many ways discrimination manifests in our daily lives. If you found value in this analysis, please consider subscribing to this channel. Each week, we explore stories that reveal important truths about our society. Not just what happened, but why it matters and what we can learn from it. And if you know someone who might benefit from this perspective, perhaps someone working in customer service, management, or anyone interested in how organizations can address bias more effectively, please share this video with them. Sometimes, the right story at the right time can shift someone's understanding in powerful ways. Thank you for engaging with this difficult but important topic. By confronting these issues head-on, we take small but significant steps toward a world where dignity isn't determined by appearance, status, or wealth, but recognized as the birthright of every human being. Until next time, remember that change often begins with awareness, continues with accountability, and is sustained through commitment. Each of us has the power to contribute to that process in our own spheres of influence.